Genesis 14. We'll get there, Genesis 14. All right. The word violence, the history of the word violence, it means vehemence, like heated, speed, a rush, and it is something done to cause pain and injury, right? Just for fun, because it's not going to make anyone uncomfortable. Can violence ever be justified?
In the Old Testament, God would tell the Israelites to go in and completely destroy people.
Okay, so we have Old Testament. God says, go wipe them out. All right, very good. Hey, good morning. Any other times violence can be justified? Sir? Self-protection. Self-defense. Very good. All right. Any other reasons why violence could be justified?
The violence of war, when you're self-protecting, but also your nation.
Yeah, okay. So personal defense, national defense, commandment of God. Very good. Any other cases in which violence could be justified? We're going to look at one today, all right? Because what the violence we're going to witness here is not the violence of self-defense necessarily, nor is it the violence of the protection of a nation. But we'll see what happens here in the text, all right? So we get into Genesis chapter 14. It says, "And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Kedor Laomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations." So you have all these different kings. These are leaders of what we would consider tribes or clans, right? That these made war with, and here's the group they made war with, Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. So they're down towards the Dead Sea. We have this group of kings who are fighting with this group of kings. And the text is going to tell us a little bit of why. Verse 4, 12 years they served Kedar Laomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled, right? Our nation was founded on a separation, which was called a rebellion from another nation, and the reasons given in our founding text is that the nation to whom we were politically tied was oppressive, and therefore they wanted to separate. And when that nation refused separation, as the Declaration of Independence says, in peace we are friends, in war we are enemies. So there's a time for war when separation is necessary. Now, the text does not say which one of these sides was right. What we have in the ancient world, however, is a classic example of one group has authority over another group. The group doesn't like having the authority over them for whatever reasons, and they seek to separate. All right? So this is ancient world, this is pre-nation, this is tribal, this is clan stuff, right? Okay, and another thing that we see here is these are non-Christian groups. These are pagan groups. All these groups worship false gods, and we know Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And one little thing I want to point out is, while we as Christians can be justifiably rebuked by pagans or non-believers, as we see with Abraham or Abram in Egypt, right? He mistreated his wife. He exercised zero faith in God. He lets his wife be his sister, and so the kings of Egypt take her so that Abram's life can be spared. And he gets rebuked rightly by that. But I want to also draw our attention to sometimes the things that the world or non-believers turn their nose up at among believers, the world is just as guilty, if not more so, of. And Christians oftentimes can be accused of certain things, we'll see here in the text. But the world's already been at it for a very long time, right? And pastors even mentioned it several times in the pulpit, the hypocrisy that the church is accused of. And there is hypocrisy in the church. But there's none in the world, right? There's a hierarchy in the church, but there's no hierarchy in the world, right? There's leadership in the church, but there's no leadership in the world, right? I just want to draw your attention to, this is more of a modern term, don't let the world gaslight you, right? That is a old-time move. I'm going to do this bad thing, but accuse you of this bad thing or of doing it to a greater degree, and that's not always the case, right? Yes, we are all sinners in need of salvation and the grace of God, but that doesn't mean we're all committing the same sins to the same degree. At any rate, verse 4, they've rebelled. Verse 5, in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and they smote. Here's who they smote. The Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Sheva Kirathaim. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that these battles took place, because where these people were slaughtered, their bodies remain. And archaeologists have uncovered different artifacts and bones that this kind of warfare happened, right? So the one group is defeating these kings, but also killing all the other people that these kings have gotten with them, right? So the Rephaims, they're being slaughtered. Verse 5, and they smote the Horites in their Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. All right. So throughout the history of the world, this is Middle East, but we can look at the North American and South American continents. We can look at the Far East. Before the times of nations, even the smaller groups would execute violence against one another and dispute and slaughter one another. This might be a little too heavy-handed, but violence and bloodshed are not the cause of the white man. Violence and bloodshed are the cause of man, humankind. Now, who's done more? That's a whole nother conversation. But violence and bloodshed are in the heart of all of us. Verse 8, and there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Sidom. So as Chedorlaomer and his group are coming down, and they are just slaughtering everyone, these 5 kings, Sodom and Gomorrah part of them, they come out to fight, and it says here in verse 9, verse 8, and there went out the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Sidom. Verse 9, Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, he had Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5, or 4 kings with 5. Verse 10, and the vale of Sidom was full of slime pits. And one theologian has noted that the ancient Hebrew here is rendered as this. The vale was full of pits of slime. And it's that Hebraic repetition that there were lots of slime pits all over the place, all right? And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell, and they that remained fled to the mountains. So the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are caught in these slime pits. Those that were with them did not stay to fight. They abandoned them. And they, this is Chedorlaomer and his group, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot. So some scholars are in a disagreement over here whether or not they took Lot because he was among the fighting group, or they took Lot because as this group came down and defeated all these kings, then they went into Sodom and Gomorrah and overtook that area and took all these other people with him. And we'll see, well, there's a piece in the text that points to that, right? But Lot is now taken captive. All right. Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew. This is the first time in the Bible the word Hebrew is used. And the word Hebrew means one from beyond. And we know that Abram is not of the land of Canaan. He is from beyond the Euphrates. He's from the land of the Chaldee. So he has come here, and he is called the Hebrew. You're the one who's not from around here. And so someone escapes from this battle. They get word to Abram. And here's where Abram is living. He dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is where we left off last week. The plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. The word confederate here means that they were all allies. They were joined in a treaty with Abram. So we have this fascinating thing happening in the ancient world where we have someone who is from beyond. He's an outsider. He is a follower of Jehovah. He is not a pagan, but he is living in a land that is predominantly occupied by pagans, and yet he has an alliance with them. And there's just a little thing to think about there in the New Testament. It talks about this. As much as is possible, we ought to live at peace with every man. It is not wrong for believers to work with non-believers. The Bible makes it very clear about the marriage between believers and non-believers and how close one works between believers and non-believers because we are unequally yoked, but that does not mean that we as believers can only interact with believers. And there's too much within Scripture examples of people who God calls out to go into a place where they're surrounded by non-believers. Paul's a classic example of this, right? He goes into, Pastor just read the passage last week, Mars Hill, and he's disputing with the Greeks who did not believe in one true God. And Paul goes into that group to try to make that argument. But he engages. Abram here is a man who is a follower of God and yet is able to work within reason with non-believers. And they have a treaty with one another. Verse 14, and when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive. So the writer, under the inspiration of God, has Lot referred to not as Abram's brother's son, his nephew. He now calls Lot his brother. And I know last week we talked a little about Lot, and we'll talk more about him. Really appreciate Jackie speaking up last week. The text does say, and into the New Testament, Lot was a righteous man. His soul is vexed. And one of the things we see in Lot, and we'll see it when God rescues him from Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll look at the passage in 2 Peter, Lot stands as a way of reminding us the mercy of God. God is extremely merciful to Lot. And I do think we mostly align with Lot more than Abram. And so a question I will ask in advance is, how often do we notice the mercy that God gives us? And what is our response to that mercy? But when we see here that the writer says Lot is Abram's brother, we know that for Abram, there is still love for Lot from his uncle Abram. He loves this man. Even though, as we saw last week, Lot's choice to pitch his tent towards Sodom was an unwise choice. Lot's lack of deference to Abram when Abram says, pick where you want to go, right? That was a self-centered choice. And yet Abram still loves Lot. So Abram, when he finds out that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318. Abram is extremely wealthy, especially by ancient world standards, not only by livestock, but by numbers of servants. We have over 300 servants that have been born in his house. And notice here, they are trained servants. Trained for what? Killing people. This is an agrarian culture. They know how to work the land. They know how to hunt. They know how to make clothes. They know how to survive off the land. But since time immemorial, since Cain starts killing his brother, right? All human beings must live with the realization that, as Victor Davis Hanson recently said in his podcast, the world does not operate according to the Sermon on the Mount. That's what we are told to operate by. But if we walk through life, sunshine and teddy bears, everything is happy-go-lucky, everyone will get along, we're ignoring reality itself. The truth is, we don't get along. And some of us don't get along in a very serious way. And so Abram, who has his servants that he's trained to fight for him, to protect him. Now, we can take our concern for safety and protection, we can definitely take that too far. But it is wise for us to go through life remembering we shouldn't trust ourselves too much, as fallen as we are. We can't trust our fellow man too much, as fallen as they are. And depending on where we live, we probably should sleep with one eye open, depending on who our neighbors are, right? So he's got a small army. He's got a little militia here. And he gives them their weapons, and they go out. So here's one reason why violence is justified. It is in the protection of those who cannot protect themselves, which is a little bit in the sense of a nation, right? And self-defense, right? If someone were to break into our home, you probably would want to protect yourself, but you'd probably want to protect those in your care who cannot defend for themselves. And of course, it is one of the great ironies, tragic ironies of how our country, even just recently, certain states want to write into their constitution the right to destroy those who cannot defend themselves. But Abram will set out, and he will pursue this army upwards towards Dan. Verse 15. He divides himself against them, he and his servants, by night, right? The early modern era could have taken some notes from Abram, because you've seen the footage of the old warfare photos where you line up, right? You shoot and we shoot, and that was considered gentlemanly. That was considered honorable. Maybe so. Not too good. And it was fascinating even in the American Revolution, and I think some of the MCA are watching the film Patriot recently. One of the things that the colonists got a grasp of was we should fight like the Native Americans. How do they fight? They fight in shadows. They move with light equipment. They know how to move in the trees. And of course, your enemies won't like that, right? You've got an advantage. The accusation of advantage is only from those who don't have the advantage you have, right? No fair. So Abram attacks at night, divides his forces, so there's a bit of a surrounding here, and when they come into the camp, they smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. So not only do they attack at night, so Abram has some martial skills. I think it might be Aristotle, I could be mistaken, but we'll go with Aristotle from now. Aristotle said, a proper education should be given to both your boys and your girls. You should teach them how to read, write, to do numbers, music, and teach them how to ride a horse and handle a sword. Warfare is actually what's known as the original martial arts, how to engage in hand-to-hand combat at a large scale. And there's a lot of skill involved in that. And Abram knew how to do this. He had men who were going to be able to fight in a way that he couldn't given his age, but he also knew how to strategize. And they go in here and they wipe these guys out, but then they pursue them even to Damascus. And when we think about violence and warfare, not that this is an in-depth study of it, but it's Augustine and then Thomas Aquinas after him who's credited with developing what's known as the just war theory. And there's several tenets. How do you make sure that a war is just? And one of those tenets is it must be, one of the things that for a war to be just, it must seek to accomplish is peace. Abram's seeking peace, right? We got to wipe these guys out. We can't just thump them on the head and then leave. They're probably going to come back. So we've got to really wipe these guys out here. And then he pursues them up into Damascus. Verse 16, and he brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot. I wonder if Lot saw Abram or if Abram and Lot had that eye contact moment. I don't know if that's too hallmarky or what. But I wonder if they saw each other. The text does not say anywhere that Abram spoke to Lot, right? Abram didn't come to him and say, you know, I did something for you you didn't deserve, right? I showed you a mercy you didn't deserve. But the text does not reveal anywhere that Lot is aware of this, but possibly he is. He brings back Lot and his goods, and here's the detail, and the women also. Well, the women did not fight in the ancient world, right? Women were not treated the best throughout the history of the world. That is true. And today, I don't know how much has changed, even though they've been given so many rights and freedoms. I don't know how much freedom we've really given them and proper honor and treatment that a woman deserves. But in the ancient world, one reason why women didn't own land and vote is because they didn't go to the battlefield and lose their lives. So if the women have been captured, some scholars have speculated Lot could have been caught among the fighters, but if he's with the women here, it is possible that he was taken as these armies killed the fighters and then moved through the cities and the towns and captured the women and children, and they take Lot with them. At any rate, he is here among the women and the people. Verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him, Abram, after his return from the slaughter. I mean, they just killed so many people. And they killed the king and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Sheva, which is the king's dale. So we have a king we've already heard about, the king of Sodom. Abram goes out on this mission. He goes out there really to rescue his brother, right? Abram's not involved in the warfare. The text doesn't tell us that any of these kings came to Abram at any point and said, hey, we're leading a revolt. Will you help us? That Abram says, no, I'm not going to do that. It really doesn't involve me. I'm sure they heard possibly of warfare as news travel, but once it involves his kin, someone that he loves. And that's usually what it takes to get into a fight, right? How much is it affecting those that I love? Whether that's the land that I live on or, the actual kin, blood kin. Abram returns, the king of Sodom comes out, and then the text introduces a character that is, up to this point, has never been mentioned. And it gives no context of like what he's been doing this whole time, right? Verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. The word Melchizedek is a combination of two ancient words that means king of righteousness. So Melchizedek is a righteous king. It says that he is the king of Salem. The word Salem means peace, so he's also the king of peace. And some scholars have speculated that this Salem is actually what will become Jerusalem in the future. So here comes this other king that's not been mentioned at all. He comes out, he brings bread and wine, which are symbols of an offering and a sacrifice, but they are also symbols of friendship, right? And it says here, he is the priest of the Most High God. He is a king and a priest. And he is not a pagan. He serves Jehovah. And watch what this man does. He blessed him. He blessed Abram. And one of the things we're going to see here in the last few minutes is this end of the passage is a high example of what true honor is. What is honor? Honor is not a gift. Honor is the recognition, the praise, the reward that someone is due. Mercy is the withholding of a judgment that we deserve. That's Lot. I mean, can we imagine what would have happened to him and those people? Captured by pagans in an ancient world? They're done. And Abram has given him a mercy and God has blessed him. Now Abram shows up, and here's this other king who is a priest who's not mentioned anywhere else in the text. He shows up, he brings bread and wine to Abram, and he blesses him. How do you know you've gotten a really good compliment? Well, it depends on who's giving the compliment, right? So watch what happens here. He blessed Abram, said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." Now, the text doesn't reveal, but I wonder if the king of Sodom is standing there listening to this, because he does not serve one God. He has his different gods that he serves. And Melchizedek comes along and says, Abram, you are blessed. You are a good man because you serve the Most High God. He owns all of it, right? Verse 20. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. one of the ways we see that Abram is a righteous man is while he does the work he ought to do, he ultimately gives the glory to the one who gave him the ability to do the work in the first place and blessed his efforts. Ultimately, all of our glory must go back to God. Verse 21, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand, and he gave him tithes of all. The language there is a little bit confusing, right? Whose he gave tithes of all? When we go to the book of Hebrews, let's go to Hebrews chapter 6. Get a little more clarity here about who gave tithes. And those of you who have been here over the last couple of weeks, Pastor has brought out this passage and has talked about it. Okay. For time, what Hebrews chapter 6 says is this. The writer of Hebrews is telling a group of believers, we know, I have heard that you are living as believers ought to live. You are not returned back into a life of sin. You are trying to do your best to serve God, even as hard as your life is right now, right? The Roman Empire is still operating right now. Many followers of Christ are being slaughtered. Many of these followers of Christ, they don't have the levels of preeminence. They are the minority. They are the outsiders. And the writer of Hebrews is telling them, I have heard that you have persevered. You have not fallen away from the faith. Bless you. Let's go, verse 13. So he's telling them, be patient and continue, because the promise that you are following is not an empty promise. Verse 13, for when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. And all of us in this room have had promises made by people, and we sit there and go, I don't know about that, because I know that person. And maybe some of us know ourselves well enough to know, I probably shouldn't make a promise because I know I'm not going to follow through with it. But God has made a promise to Abram, has sworn by himself, there's no one greater, and here's what God told him. Surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so, this is Abram, because he got a promise from God, he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. And the promise is that city whose builder and maker is God. Abraham found the place for his soul. And one day, his body and soul, right? We will all be glorified. And the writer of Hebrews is telling, just as Abram received a promise from the greatest one of all and met that promise, you will as well, if you're pursuing the same promise. And then the writer goes on to say, watch this. For men verily swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is to them an end of all strife. You usually make a swear on whoever is greater than you are. Wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto us, the heirs of promise, the immutability of his counsel. God does not change. If he makes a promise, he will keep it. He confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we must have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. We do not follow after cunningly devised tales or some lie. We follow after the truth from the truth itself. And just as Abram received it, we can get there too. Be patient and endure. The promise is coming. And then he goes right into here. Lay hold upon the hope set before us, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil, whither the forerunner for us is entered. How are we able to have that hope in God's promise? How are we able to cross through that veil into the Holy of Holies and know that we can trust God and that God is going to keep his promise to us? Because Jesus did that for us. And Jesus is made an high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And in the chapter 7, the passage tells us a little bit more about who Melchizedek is. He had no father, he had no mother, he had no descendants. He's a king and a priest. He serves God. He blesses Abram, and Abram gives him a tithe of all. And some scholars have noted he didn't give him a tithe of the spoils of war. He gave him a tithe of all his possessions. He gave a 10% tithe. That is an act of honor because Melchizedek deserved it. And many scholars have speculated that Melchizedek is possibly a theophany, Christ in the Old Testament. And if not Christ, God in the Old Testament come down. But if not even that, the scripture makes it clear that he is a man in pursuit of God and is higher than Abram. And Abram recognized that and pays honor to Melchizedek. And verse 22. So the king of Sodom, I don't know if he sees all this, but he watches these two men interact with each other and they give honor to one another. They give to each other what is due. The higher giving to the lower what is due, and the lower giving to the higher what is due. This is reality. This is our creator and creation. This is the life of the believer, what it should be. And Abram said, the king of Sodom came up and said, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. I want all the people you rescued, but you get to keep the food and any sort of weapons. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I lift up mine hand, which is an old phrase that means I have taken an oath, right? I've pledged unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Well, some of us sit back and go, why would the king of Sodom say something like that? Abram did him a service, right? But aren't we humans good at spinning what we want to spin to make us look better than we actually look, right? The king of Sodom, who couldn't rescue himself, Abram comes in and could have just said, I'm going to rescue Lot and not help you, actually help Sodom. But Abram knows this man enough. You're going to go spin that in the wrong way. So I will not put any trust in you. And who knows, the food that Abram lost, who knows the things that he lost as a result of doing this, he could have taken that and he said, I'm not going to take anything. I'm going to trust that God will supply for me. And then lastly, he says here, verse 24, Abram says, save only that which the young men have eaten and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. And in fact, in other words, Abram says, I made an oath because of the God I serve. These men did not make the same oath, and they don't have to make the same oath, so I'm not going to make them abide by the way that I abide. Please give them the things they deserve. I don't need anything from you. That's a really hard thing to walk away from. Who doesn't like glory and recognition and praise, right? And here's a case where Abram has to say, I can't accept it from you because I know you are not an honorable person. And we go right into chapter 15, and we'll leave off with this one detail. You know the story of Abram already. God has promised him a land and an heir and descendants. Abram just had a huge moment of, martial success. But what does Abram still not have? An heir. Right? He still does not have the thing he's been promised. And he still has not reached the city whose builder and maker is God. And we're going to start chapter 15, and chapter 15 begins with God remaking that promise to Abram. I will give you a descendant, and you will be innumerable. It will happen. And then because Abram is a human, that is the very same chapter that we're going to watch Abram make a really bad choice. All right? And we'll come back to that next week. Thank you.